I'm Matt at Nexus Baseball, and this is episode 52 of the Tommy John Epidemic. This series is a YouTube read of content from the book Plague of the Gods, an outsider's perspective on baseball's Tommy John epidemic, which is available now on Amazon. I decided to put this content on YouTube to make the material as accessible as possible. This series examines the science behind the most superhuman action the human body can produce, accelerating a baseball up to 100 miles per hour. Baseball is a game of tradition and history. Historically, the game has been very reticent to introduce drastic change of any sort, instead evolving through gradual change with the times. This is changing rapidly, however, with the league, teams, and fans more likely than ever to accept new ideas and changes. Since the turn of the century, this process of gradual change has become supercharged, with new technology, rules changes, and training methods. The result, unfortunately, has been injury on a grand scale. By better understanding pitching mechanics, the game can better train and manage its exceptional athletes. It can keep them safe as well as allow them to not be held back from their true potential. It can also change the terminology that observers utilize to describe the process and approaches they see when they watch the game, replacing colloquialisms like a loose arm, a strong arm, and easy cheese with the anatomy and physics that produce what we as viewers see on the diamond. Critics might argue that as a relative outsider to the realm of professional baseball, that who am I to challenge the status quo and the existing methodologies for understanding and teaching pitching? I would counter that baseball has been trying for a decade, with minimal success, to address the issue of UCL damage through a variety of approaches, often with results being the opposite of what was intended. This demonstrates to me a fundamental misunderstanding of the processes involved. Part of the difficulty is that professional baseball, like any organization, has a particular way of doing things and a lot of built-in assumptions and biases. The people that work in the sport have a great deal of institutional inertia, and when challenges arise, it's often hard to step back and examine the issue from a different angle. As an outside observer that returned to baseball later in my life, I did not enter baseball analysis with many assumptions. In fact, most of my preconceptions were based on the need to build athleticism through resistance training, as I've been doing throughout my life. I approached the process with a healthy dose of skepticism and followed where the evidence led to develop my own conclusions. By approaching the sport from the perspective of a mixed martial artist and strength and conditioning coach, I saw a great deal of similarity, but also discovered a great deal of difference that challenged some of my assumptions I had had about my previous sport and helped inform my understanding of baseball. This outsider's perspective can be useful to any organization to challenge built-in biases and assumptions and allow for new areas of inquiry and new approaches. Interestingly, a lot of the traditional approaches turned out to be correct, with most of the problems created by the clash between the traditional and the modern changes to training methodologies. In a May 22, 2019 Blue Jays game, commentator Dan Schulman stated that he believed the greatest mystery in baseball is why pitchers with reduced workloads break now more than they did in the past with heavier workloads. Buck Martinez, his counterpart, answered that it was his belief that the culprit was max effort throwing, arguing that veteran pitching coaches should block the weight room. Although reductionist, the answer illustrates that baseball traditionalists like Martinez have an understanding that the way pitchers are throwing today and the approach they've trained to get there is somehow wrong and at the heart of pitching injuries. To develop the theories described, I've spent over 5 years experimenting with different approaches and testing theories using my own body as a testbed. I refused to teach others if I could not determine the efficacy of the approach or its safety myself. Training using both hands for both pitching and hitting was a double-edged sword, as it slowed the adaptation process to each change and challenged my brain to make corrections, while at the same time providing the ability to test theories more frequently and the ability to compare why certain things seem to perform differently on each side of the body. It was through this juxtaposition that I came to understand the importance of anatomy in the throwing motion. I could not always replicate a certain motion on both sides of my body and wanted to know why. So in addition to reading every work published about pitching I could find, I also approached it from an anatomy perspective that was not present in any of the works I had seen. By experimenting on my body to isolate individual muscles and their functions in the motion, I realized that a lot of what I was reading was contradictory. The great hurdle that took most of the time to reconcile was this disconnect between what research was telling me and what my body and my experimentation was showing me. The research was telling me to throw harder using my legs and my lats, two areas that I already well developed in, having a strong weightlifting background. The more I followed this approach, the less successful I became. In fact, I suffered the only injury I've had in this development process, UCL discomfort and forearm tendinitis, that came from pulling down on the ball using the lat in the forearm as I had been shown. I took time off to rest and decided to go back to the basics to discover one muscle at a time what the correct process was, and most importantly how I could develop the precision control in the appropriate muscles. I also compared my baseball research with my knowledge base from boxing to further analyze parallels and contrasts. Having a sensitive UCL on my right arm, I was particularly aware of the role of the forearm in protecting the UCL, as I saw over and over the same mistakes I had been making demonstrated at the professional level. Conducting a tremendous amount of research on the associated pitching injuries, I realized that the lack of understanding of the process of pitching was resulting in the injuries that were multiplying across baseball. That the existing methodologies that had developed over the last decade were the problem. Pitchers were being trained incorrectly, and it was hurting them. It was at this point that I decided to write this work to share my experiences and to help address these issues both at the professional level, as well as most importantly in youth players that are just developing their skill sets. As you compare the approach that has been presented to the Major League game, hopefully you will see how what I have described fully conforms to these realities. Fortunately, there's never been a more innovative time since the early years of the game, with changes occurring at a rapid pace and both the teams and the audience willing to accept new ideas and innovations. Within the last 10 years, the game has exploded with analytics of every sort, quantifying and analyzing every detail of performance. We now see shifts in pitching strategies we have never seen before, while on our screens artificial intelligence predicts outcomes and chances of success or failure based on dozens of data points. We live in an era of a game in flux, deciding what it is going to be for the next century. This acceptance of change will hopefully allow the baseball community to challenge their underlying assumptions and understand the interesting anatomy and physics that have always made baseball the game of choice for scientists. The goal being not to make the game colder and more mechanical, but to improve the level of play and athleticism on display while improving the safety of the players we all love to watch. At the same time, giving fans a better appreciation of the technical prowess required to execute an act as simple at its heart as throwing a ball to the catcher. The implementation of the techniques described will take a good deal of time to be recognized and implemented, with change challenging to existing professionals so patterned on a single approach. The key element being the recognition and understanding of the processes involved, so that pitchers can become more involved in how their own bodies work and understand how they can both stay safe and get outs. It is important, I think, to recognize that both the biomechanics described and the philosophies of pitcher workload I have presented already work with the developmental path the game is on. Pitchers have always used the mechanics I've described, particularly those that commentators and observers would say throw in an effortless manner. It is not that they are not trying as hard as the next pitcher, it's just that their mechanics are in sync to have the smoothest transition of forces from the ground to ball, without in essence fighting their own muscles and body positions in the throw. The modern training methodologies have made that process much more challenging through the misunderstanding of force generation and what is truly required to throw the baseball with competitive velocities. In the modern game of ever-declining pitcher workloads, we could also allow pitchers to throw more frequently and provide more innings while better maintaining safety. The use of pitching lines instead of starters will upset traditionalists, but is the natural organic conclusion of what analytics are telling us anyway. The pitchers are at their best when they're used once through the order. By better managing workloads, we can improve the safety of the pitching staff while at the same time allowing most pitchers to work many more innings than they can today. This will allow the stars to still produce at a high level, therefore not reducing their value to the team, while keeping them healthier. In terms of WAR, or wins above replacement, and other modern analytics we use to gauge player value, the analysis is based on the number of innings pitched and the quality of those innings, rather than how many times a pitcher went deep into a game. The Clayton Kershaws and Max Scherzers will still be those dominant pitchers that carry their teams and fans love to see, producing at the same rates, with the added benefit of seeing them every 3 days instead of every 5. Meanwhile, I believe that youth baseball development is primed to evolve into a more progressive system that will better foster and keep young players in the game as they age. It is devastating to me that so many promising young athletes are suffering debilitating injuries, primarily due to poor teaching practices. A key reason for writing this work was to not only help professionals, but provide a new methodology for teaching young people, and to propose a new approach for Major League Baseball to be better involved in the youth development process. MLB is already on this track, having developed several youth initiatives over the past 5 years, in part to draw younger fans to a game with a rapidly aging fan base. The focus through the implementation sections of this work has been on the need to get the league itself more involved in its future and provide safety standardization for youth development, as well as by setting baseline standards of safety for professional baseball. A large part of this process is better engaging young people with the professional product through partnerships at these lower levels. The technology is at a point where this would be a relatively easy process to implement, and one that would produce great rewards in safety, engagement, and by producing a better stream of fundamentally sound prospects to the professional level. Athleticism should be defined as the ability to compete in an athletic endeavor to the peak of one's abilities while doing so in a safe manner. Too often the safety aspect has been sacrificed to achieve a little extra performance, to reach a goal, or achieve a financial reward. Although absolute safety is an impossibility, I believe that it is important to realize that relative safety from utilizing good practices is achievable and something that should be prized. Performance should not be compromised due to safety, but instead good technique should breed high performance. In the process of testing and analyzing the techniques I've described, I've been able to develop the mobility and coordination needed to throw and hit at competitive levels with each-handedness. This is not due to any innate athleticism, but almost in spite of it. The athleticism that was required was quite different from that which I possessed previously, and the more I came to realize that, the more success I saw. Hopefully, this knowledge can help pitchers better understand their bodies and how to utilize them. That through this knowledge, we can better understand how the superhuman is achievable and how we can make baseball a safe and thriving game in the 21st century. That was the final episode of this series. Remember, if you like the content, please like and subscribe. Your support makes this work possible. Also, please consider picking up the book on Amazon from the link in the description below. There's also a full range of Nexus Baseball programs available as well. Thank you for watching this series.